Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Andrew Garrett, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley. So therefore, a colleague. You're sitting probably less than a mile from where I am at the moment, but also the author of this book here, The Unnaming of Kroeber Hall, Language, Memory, and Indigenous California. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Now, this book is basically the story in part of current events, things that I recall experiencing a few years ago when there were a number of renamings of buildings here at Berkeley. And we actually had sort of a committee. I don't know if that's like a standing committee that has a perpetual life, but there's a committee that decides to remove names of problematic characters from our history from the buildings. But it also, I think, is more than that, a deep dive into the life of Alfred Kroeber, who was a super famous linguist, anthropologist, historian. The boundaries between those disciplines were actually, I guess, being formed during his lifetime. And it sort of challenges sort of the common perception of this man's life, at least the perception that people have who aren't really familiar with him, right? And the story that is told by the unnaming. And I think at the end of the day, you come out in favor of the renaming of the building, in spite of the fact that much of the narrative that was told about him was, in fact, factually inaccurate. So I guess I want maybe we start with how did this whole unnaming thing get started? I mean, we know what happened in 2020, and there's a lot of stuff happening in 2020, and people were acutely sensitive to racism and issues related to our past here in California University. So how did this whole thing get started?
I don't really know what the kind of background from the point of view of the people who were most interested in doing the renaming, but as you say, like it was in the air in the US generally and in California. And on the Berkeley campus, there have been for a long time a number of buildings whose names honor people that were felt to be hurtful by various campus communities. And so in that summer
Including
of 20,
Bolt, right? So including the
including
law
Bolt
school,
at the law school, yeah.
Bolt Hall, right? Which we changed the name of that.
Yeah, Bolt was the first one to go. And I think that was inspiring for people. Like they recognized that it was possible to do something about these names. And they're all like each case is a little different from each other case, but they're all characters who are regarded as problematic in some way or symbolic of hurtful aspects of history in some way. And so actually on the same day in the summer of 2020, proposals came in to the campus committee that you mentioned to unname several buildings. And one of them was Kroeber Hall, which, as you say, was named after a prominent anthropologist and linguist. I think he wouldn't have called himself a historian. In fact, I know he wouldn't have called himself a historian, but definitely an anthropologist and a linguist and a big deal in the field of anthropology, and to a lesser extent, a big deal in linguistics. So I have been working in the shadow of Kroeber's work for a long time, for over 20 years. I've spent a lot of time in the archives working with his materials and trying to use notes that he took in various ways. And the discourse that surrounded the proposal to unname that building seemed off to me. And that was kind of what got me started on this particular path.
Well, now you're at the California Language Archive, right? Now this is presumably an institution that's dedicated to the preservation of languages and archival materials that preserve those languages. And you're an expert in the Yurok language, is that right?
Yeah, I work with the Yurok tribe and doing language documentation and language revitalization with the Yurok language in Northwest California. And that was actually
Well,
that was the language that Kroeber worked with most. He worked with many, many California languages, but Yurok was the one that he was kind of most intensely devoted to. So I had a very good sense, I think, of what kinds of work he did.
Right. Now, of course, I wasn't terribly surprised by the support for this unnaming among the student population, who are generally not terribly educated in things like anthropology. But it seems like the bulk of the anthropology department itself was also in support of the renaming.
Yeah, that's right. And I think probably most anthropologists nationally would have supported it. And I also supported changing the name. Um, I'm not quite sure what was in the minds of specific members of that department. I think it would be a range of people who were fully on board with all of the claims that were made about Kroeber to people who just felt, as I feel, that what Kroeber symbolized in the history of university Indigenous relations was so toxic, regardless of what he did, and remained so painful for Indigenous students and members of Indigenous communities around California that it would be better just to get rid of the name. So there was some mix of that, I think, in the faculty community.
Right. And there were three main allegations, right? Or three main justifications for the removal of his name. Could you walk through each of those three sort of claims or allegations? I mean, there were different reasons. So one reason had to do with facts related to Kroeber and his life, and then another reason had to do with just the feelings that it evoked, right? Completely independent of what may have happened on the ground. But maybe if we focus on the first, and those allegations against Kroeber, what were they?
Sure, there were three things that were brought up and have been brought up for many years in kind of this general space of discussion. One was that Kroeber was involved with and supervised the excavation and preservation of ancestral remains taken from Indigenous burials and other locations. Berkeley has, as I think probably everybody knows, a massive collection of Indigenous remains that are kept on campus in, I don't know how to put it exactly, in defiance of the wishes of most Indigenous communities. And Berkeley has been really, really slow in repatriating them to communities that have asked to get their bones back so they can rebury them. So Kroeber was in charge of the Anthropology Museum during the years when much of this was taking place. That was kind of one critique. A second critique was that um, he was involved with the Indigenous person who is called Ishi, who came came into the town of Oroville in the early 1910s and then was taken to San Francisco to the Anthropology Museum, where he was studied by anthropologists and linguists. And this was regarded as, by some people, as a kind of inhumane exhibition of an Indigenous person. He died there a few years later of tuberculosis. So his involvement in the situation of Ishi was the second charge. And the third was the claim that he's responsible um, for certain Ohlone communities not having federal recognition due to saying in his classic overview of California indigenous tribes, saying that those Ohlone communities were um, extinct, quote unquote.
Right. And then three together sort of combined to into one general claim, which is that his values were inconsistent with the contemporary values of the University of California. Um,
Yeah, and the broader claim also that you kind of alluded to before is the claim that he is, and I think this is actually accurate, for better or worse, that he had become a symbol
yeah.
of um, academic engagement with Indigenous people in California, and that has been as I said, a toxic history, and kind of that there's no resolution to that symbolism other than taking his name away.
Yeah. Now, of course, we have no control over the symbolism that gets attached to our names, but we do have control over our actions. And so maybe we can dig into Kroeber's actions. I mean, when you look back at his work and you look back at his points of view, I mean, he seems to represent pretty close to what we might think of as anti-racist positions. Could we maybe dig back into the school of anthropology out of which he came, right, from Franz Boas, and sort of how to what extent was it in alignment with the sort of contemporary views that most people had? Because it seems like if you went back in time and you created a spectrum of people who are, I guess, eugenicists and racist on one end, and sort of anti-racist, anti-eugenicist on the other end. I mean, he would probably be in the, I don't know, the one percentile on the other end. I mean, he's about as anti-racist and anti-eugenicist as one could be in that time period. I mean, is that an accurate statement?
I mean, he was certainly very anti-eugenicist. Eugenics was a big deal in early 20th century America and early 20th century California. Eugenics meaning, you know, um, trying to quote unquote improve the population by selective immigration policies or, um, uh, you know, causing people to not be able to have kids or whatever. Like those ideas were very prominent in the period before the First World War, before the Second World War, and Kroeber was one of a small number of people who were quite vocal in opposing eugenics. Racism is more complicated. The way that people talked about it at the time, I think, was usually about eugenics. And as I said, he was a very vocal anti-eugenicist. It seems to me that he was anti-racist, although maybe that's an anachronistic way of
Mm.
talking. Certainly, the Boas school that you mentioned is well known um, for at least certain anti-racist positions, in contrast to previous anthropologists and other kind of schools of anthropology, which had a evolutionary point of view that, according to which some cultures were more advanced than some other cultures, more primitive cultures. And the part of the goal of anthropology was to chart how superior cultures came about out of inferior cultures. The Boas school definitely rejected that perspective, and was interested in looking at individual cultures on their own terms, what later got called cultural relativism. Kroeber was very committed to that perspective. So, yeah, I think in the context of the time, he would count as anti-racist, though, as I say, maybe that's a little bit anachronistic. Certainly very vocally anti-eugenic. And he had a lot of correspondence with prominent eugenicists of the time. He gave public lectures, not in the academic context, but, you know, to broader audiences that critiqued eugenics. And a lot of his publications in the 1910s and 1920s were anti-eugenics publications.
Yeah, he seemed to get into a lot of fights or altercations with folks who on the other side, like this guy Jordan, who was at Stanford. I mean, it seems like his position was the more common position at the time.
Yeah, Jordan was a prominent eugenicist, and was himself the subject of some unnaming at Stanford University. He was the president of Stanford, and he had actually hired Kroeber when he first came to California and worked for the California Academy of Sciences. But Jordan was in the 1910s, I forget the dates exactly, Jordan was working on a book in which he argued that uh, war sapped societies of their most virile elements, and wrote to Kroeber about this topic in relation to California Indian people. And Kroeber was really quite sharp in responding to him. Um,
Well, maybe you can talk a bit about the state of Native Americans in California in the 19th century. I mean, it seems like when you go to other parts of the country, there is much more evidence of Native history than in California. I mean, it seems like California had sort of a uniquely, um, well, I guess it's hard to say uniquely brutal, but the brutal campaign to exterminate Native Americans that was, um, I guess there was less bargaining power. They had less bargaining power than some of the more organized tribes in the middle of America.
yeah, it's hard to compare genocides. Um, they're all pretty bad. What's really distinctive about California in this context is that it had two sociopolitically distinct waves of genocide. So there was first the ethnocide and genocide that occurred in the Spanish mission period, when the Spanish came along coastal southern and central California and set up the missions and kind of tried to culturally eradicate the populations of that region and take them all into the missions, make them into basically serfs, and kill the ones who resisted. There was that activity of the late 18th and early 19th century. And then there was the white American genocide of the mid to later 19th century that happened together with the discovery of gold and this huge rush of people from the rest of North America into California, um, sort of to take over, basically to take over land for minerals and for agriculture and for other purposes. And that period from the 1840s into the 1880s, 1890s was just filled with horrible, horrible acts of genocidal massacre. Some of them state supported, some of them private.
But I think California had unique amount of linguistic and ethnic diversity, right? It kind of
Yeah,
reminded me of New Guinea, right? I mean, you'd go 10 miles and you'd get a almost completely unrelated language group, right? Whereas in the middle of America, at least by the time the United States started entering into the territory, you had large kind of Apache empires and so forth,
right.
right?
In areas that are in around the world that are largely large grassland, just wide spaces of grassland, you will get cultures and language groups that cover a large territory. In areas like California that are geographically really heterogeneous and have lots of microclimates, as we say now, the populations tend to be small. So the indigenous populations of California were numerous but small. There were maybe 100 different languages belonging to maybe about 20 different language families, totally unrelated language families. So there were many California groups that were 500 people or 1,000 people or 2,000 people. And then you go to the next river valley, and there was a different group that was equally small that spoke a different language. And it may be that that context um, made the nature of resistance somewhat different.
Mm.
Um, uh, yeah, and it meant that it was easier to eradicate a whole language, for
Yeah.
example, or a whole cultural tradition because you had fewer people to kill.
Well,
Or
I mean, it seemed to be pretty obvious to everybody at the time that these language groups were disappearing at a rapid clip, right? I mean, today we talk about vanishing languages. I don't know if the pace of language disappearance now is greater than it was then, but I mean, it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that these societies and cultures were sort of disappearing right in front of their eyes, right?
it's a funny aspect of academia that people in academia from Boas onward have been obsessed with articulating to potential um, funders, I suppose you could say, the urgency of the need to document languages before they quote unquote disappear. And Boas wrote to Phoebe Hearst describing exactly that need in the very late 19th century in the same way that people now, 125 years later, also describe it. So it's something that's been going on for a long time. In every generation, I feel Indigenous people surprise those outsiders by being resilient and being persistent and finding ways to carry forward their cultures and their languages, despite all these oppressive and destructive factors. But there's no question that at the end of the 19th century, it was a real low point all around North America and in California in particular. The tribes had no powers, basically. They had been um, thoroughly subjugated and were dependent in many places on philanthropy and government handouts for whatever, healthcare and education and other resources they could get.
Right. And so I think one of the accusations against Kroeber was that he was a believer in this vanishment hypothesis, right? That these cultures were in fact endangered. So, I had trouble trying to figure out how that was racist or harmful. I mean, it seems like somebody who's doing everything they can to try to preserve it based on the belief that it's disappearing. I think it seems like the critics were implying that a belief in its disappearance was somehow a support for its disappearance. I mean, aren't those different?
Yeah, so the vanishment idea or hypothesis, which people talk about sometimes in terms of the quote unquote myth of the vanishing Indian, that's the belief that Indian cultures will disappear. And I think it's correct that Boas and Kroeber, who was his student, believed that. They believed that Indian cultures would not survive. And that was part of what motivated for them documenting what they could document. It would have been better, in my opinion, I think in most people's opinions nowadays, it would have been better if Kroeber had seen more potential. Um, that is, if he had seen the possibility of survival and persistence in Indigenous communities, because they have survived and they have persisted despite that vanishment belief. One of the things that the vanishment belief leads you to do, I think, is to not focus energy on kind of recording ways in which communities are changing and adapting to the new
Mhm.
environment. And that's one of the criticisms that people have often offered of anthropology of this period, that they were concerned only in documenting what was disappearing. They were not concerned with documenting how things were changing and what the present day, 1900, what the present day um, complicated, we might now say multicultural community had become, because by the early 1900s, people spoke English as well as indigenous languages. They had complicated cultures that engaged with um, Anglophone society and indigenous society and multiple indigenous societies. And this kind of notion that they were vanishing, I think, um, made it easier for people like Kroeber to ignore the complexities of the societies in front of him. Um, so they were kind of looking towards the past, and like that's a critique that people have often made, and I think that critique is accurate. I agree with you that that's not intrinsically racist. It's just kind of myopic in the way that some ideas that we have now are going to turn out to be myopic too.
But it seems, I mean, isn't this just a division of labor? I mean, are they mutually inconsistent? Can't you have some anthropologists that are studying contemporary evolution, others that are studying the past? I mean, as a trained historian, I know that if I'm studying 18th century France, I can do that without having to concern myself with how things evolved after that point in time, right? And I mean, we don't seem to have similar sensitivities when it comes to studying, say, the Etruscans or the Trojans. Um, I guess. I mean, why can't we have both things coexisting inside an anthropology department? It,
Sure.
it seems like there seems a big debate over the purpose of anthropology, and there has to be one purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm reluctant to say what the purpose of anthropology should be. I think at that time, though, um, nobody was doing the other thing. Nobody was actually, um, almost nobody was working in indigenous communities and trying to describe and understand what the situation of those communities in the present was. They were
Yeah.
in those, people like Kroeber were in those communities to try and figure out what it had used to be like. Um, and so I think if one person had done the kind of work that he did and another person had done the other work, then I think the critiques would not,
Mm.
uh, those critiques would not be relevant. But pretty much everybody was doing the same kind of thing, going into a community that's complicated and looking for the oldest people to try to find out what things used to be like in the mythologized pure past.
So this is a part of that essentialism
Yeah.
that Francois has believed in. I mean, so did linguistics have? I mean, linguistics as a field uh, presumably has evolved. Did they at one point dismiss things like Creoles and Pidgins as being somehow inferior to these pure original languages? Is that sort of part of the motivation?
Yeah, there was a lot of disdain in linguistics until pretty recently for any kind of language mixture um, or synergy, or people sometimes nowadays use the term interlanguage. Things like Spanglish, language contact varieties, all of that was regarded as secondary or less important until maybe the 1970s, 1980s. And certainly in the first part of the 20th century, that was not a focus of interest except among very few people. So like
But that,
that essentialism idea that you mentioned, like the idea that there's such a thing as an essential properties of culture and the language that belongs essentially to that culture, those are puristic or um, kind of authenticity oriented discourses that lead you to look at certain phenomena and ignore certain other phenomena. For example, Kroeber, when he was doing language documentation, like he encountered obviously people who were multilingual. I mean, anybody who's multilingual in their speech will sometimes use the resources of the other languages that they know. He, like other people of the time, he routinely kind of suppressed that evidence of other languages coming in. So he would, when he described Yurok texts, he would omit references to English that might be in the Yurok texts, or when he described Ohlone language use in the Bay Area, and people, of course, use lots of Spanish loanwords, he would sometimes omit those
mm,
because those were not part of the quote unquote real language. So I think, yeah, that notion that there's a pure or authentic thing that we're striving to understand, that was a very 19th century notion that's found in all kinds of 19th century discourses, and they were still in this time in the grip of that. And it
yeah.
leads
So
you it leads you to miss interesting complexity that's going on in
yeah.
front of you.
Well, so Kroeber was originally a student of literature, right? And so wasn't there a belief? I mean, linguistics became a very formalistic discipline at some point, but in its early days, it was grounded in this belief that the, your way of understanding the world, like your Umwelt, was dictated by your language, right? So this is, Worf and Sapir. Those are the guys who were prominent at the time. And so when Kroeber was recording all of these stories and narratives, right, he was doing so in the belief that when the language disappears, the entire way of looking at the world will also disappear, right?
I don't think he ever articulated that particular position. And that version of the Sapir and Worf idea, which is just one version of that idea, that didn't really become prominent until later in the 20th century. Sapir was a slightly younger student of Boas, and Worf was then a student of Sapir's in the 20s or 30s. Boas himself was definitely a cultural relativist in that sense, but I don't know that he would have said that your language dictates how you see the world. He did believe, I think, that there's a correlation between aspects of your language and aspects of your experience, but the nature of the causal relationship might be somewhat different. So Kroeber never articulated precisely the rationale that you described. His rationale that he articulated when he was kind of pressed to articulate it is actually that by recording all of this material from a variety of cultures, we were enriching world culture. That was his perspective. Um,
Right.
in the same way, I
So
think that we would be enriching world culture if we found new ancient Greek authors and wrote about
right.
those, or new early English authors.
Or like Icelandic sagas. So this is based on a belief that we, by experiencing these stories, this would allow us to see the world in a different way. And referring the us are the people who are outside of that culture.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that he struggled. My sense is that he struggled throughout his life to try and kind of understand that perspective, like to understand what the purpose of his work was. Even
Mhm.
very late in his life, he wrote in a somewhat puzzled way about not quite knowing why he was doing, like he was committed to doing certain things, but he clearly didn't quite understand why he was doing them, why he was committed.
Well, it seems like even if it wasn't his intent, it seems like the recording of these narratives actually helped for these cultures to become preserved. I
Exactly.
mean,
Well, I think even more to the point, it helps them go on. So there's a way in which, like, he thought he was doing this work for world culture, like preserving something that would otherwise be completely lost in societies that, in his opinion, would disappear. And he was preserving that information for world culture when I think one of the important uses that have been made of his material is actually not for world culture, but for those cultures where
Yeah.
there's this massive archive of material from their grandparents or great grandparents or great great grandparents that they can use in cultural and language revival projects today. So it's like it's the thing that he didn't see was possible, this survival of indigenous cultures, that he in fact helped make possible.
So how do the contemporary members of these native tribes view someone like Kroeber? Because it seems like without his work, they wouldn't have access to their history, right? Because no one else was writing this stuff down. No one else was recording it as of those moments in time. Yeah, of course, there's oral traditions that were continuing. But as we know, oral traditions evolve, and if Homer hadn't written down, his stories, all we would know about is Taylor Swift and so forth, right? So, I mean, we're grateful that Homer wrote this stuff down. Are the Native American tribes, do they have a sense of appreciation for the work of these early linguists?
I think there's a range of perspectives, and I wouldn't want to speak for Indigenous people. I've spoken to people who um, are quite negative about Kroeber because of the reasons that we talked about earlier. I've spoken to people who are really grateful for the materials that they've used in kind of getting access to their own linguistic history. I've spoken to people who have said, yeah, his work was really valuable, but I just want to hold him at an arm's length away from me. So I think there's a range of perspectives.
Right. Because I think there's a position that you articulately mentioned in the book, which is that because of this horrific colonial project, basically anyone who was alive at the time was implicit, more or less, regardless of what they did. Um, and that anthropology, in particular, is implicit, more or less, no matter what it does, right? So, is it part of the University of California, which is, part of this colonial enterprise? I mean, there's really nothing that Kroeber could have done differently that would have gotten him from out of this shadow of collective colonial guilt, right? I mean, is is that a position that a lot of people hold? I mean, that the enterprise itself was just so horrible that everybody was implicit. Anybody who was working for the University of California, anybody who was working for the federal government, anybody who was, um, you know, working in the field of anthropology. I mean, is there anything Kroger could have done different?
I don't know. I mean, I think like he could have um, he when Ishi showed up in Oroville in 1911, um, Kroeber could have focused entirely on finding a sort of humane solution to his life rather than doing any cultural or linguistic documentation with him. I'm not sure that would have been very successful, but he could have done that. He could have uh, he could have seen that it was not for outsiders to deal in ancestral remains, and he could have refused
Mm.
to accept any kind of ancestral remains into the museum. Um, he could have chosen not to document um, ceremonial and mythological and traditional narrative texts, but instead to kind of focus on the present conditions of Indian people and devote his career, as many people now do, devote his career to sort of advocating for the human rights of Indigenous people. So I mean, he could, I suppose, have done those things, and then his, I think the perspective that people would have now on him would have been quite different. If he had done those things, then we would also have been deprived of a large archive of those stories and songs and vocabularies and oral histories and things that he was responsible for recording that are really valuable. But he could have done those different things.
Now, you also talk about how he involved a lot of Native Americans in the actual project itself. Right? He had them do some data collection, and he developed some strong friendships with people from different Native communities. What was the role of his friendships in his projects? I mean, was it unusual at the time to have those kinds of friendships and collaborations?
I think it was. The person he was closest to, for example, was a person named Juan Dolores, who was an Oda man who had grown up in Arizona, had been educated in US government schools, and wound up in California in the 1910s and somehow got in touch with Kroeber. Dolores had a research fellowship from the university for a year to do language documentation. He was primarily responsible for the material in a grammar that another guy wrote of the language, based entirely on Juan Dolores's speech. And he devoted himself, Dolores, to uh, recording narratives and songs and oral histories in the O'odham language for many decades. Kroeber had taught him how to write, and kind of gave him support in that work throughout his life. They were close friends. Dolores was also a family friend, so spent his summer vacations with the Kroeber family. Um, and he's one of the most prominent early 20th century Native intellectuals, Dolores, in the sense of having created this body of written literature in the O'odham language. My sense of Kroeber's relationship to that work was basically that Kroeber just wanted to give him space to do what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was to kind of preserve all of these stories and find ways to get them kind of out there in the world. And they're still being used, those stories, by people in the O'odham community for language purposes. Um, and he had a lot of California and nearby kind of indigenous collaborators that
Mhm.
he wrote to a lot, that came to the Bay Area to work with him. Um, some of them I would say are friends, some of them were friendly.
Well, it seemed like one of the critiques of Kroeber was that he actually employed natives in a variety of roles, um, and this was seen as exploitative to some degree.
My sense is that Ishi is the only person for whom that critique has been really made.
Tell us about
Lived
Ishi.
Ishi lived and worked in the museum for the last years of his life. And for part of that time, I think about 7 months, he participated in cultural demonstrations. He didn't speak English at all at the beginning, and never came to speak English very well. So those demonstrations took the form of Ishi on display, so to speak, doing some cultural practice like flint knapping or arrow making or something like that, to a white audience in the museum, while somebody who either was an indigenous person or a white person would explain to the audience what was going on. For many people, that has seemed too similar to the kind of capture and display of indigenous people in zoos and
Yeah.
fairs and whatnot. To defenders of Kroeber, I think that's just been seen as akin to a modern docent type of situation where a person is kind of showing you in a museum what happens. But yeah, Ishi really was the only person I think uh, whose work was critiqued in that way, as like somebody who, in the criticism, was forced to live in the museum, and forced to be on display.
Yeah, because it seems like there's a movement now in cultural affairs around the world to populate the museums and the local archaeological sites with people from the local region, right? So if you go down to Mexico, for instance, and visit some of the monuments, instead of having folks from Mexico City running the tours, the goal is to have local Mexico people say running the tours, and that's seen as progressive, right? So, I mean, could that be seen as exploitative as well?
I don't know enough to answer that question for that context. Kroeber was himself certainly interested in hiring Indigenous people um, as kind of museum guides or museum explainers. Um, I mean, yeah, in that context, I don't know, the museum culture was, the museum was a museum for, it was Phoebe Hearst's museum
Yeah.
for the collections that she was responsible for assembling, and it was a museum for elite San Francisco white people to come and look at stuff. So, um, it wasn't a very multicultural experience exactly in the modern
Right.
sense. So I think it
Hmm.
would be a little disquieting to watch, probably. But I think, I mean, Kroeber's perspective seemed from the letters that he wrote to people, seemed to be, you would be a good explainer of this material. Would you like a job working in the museum to do that? Um,
Yeah, because I mean, you could have hired white people, I guess, to do the
and
job.
did. I mean, most of the
Yeah,
people who did that were white anthropologists.
yeah. Well, in terms of the remains, because that seems to be still a burning issue, right? So there are these archaeological remains, and I mean, some of them are archaeological remains. Some are things like cultural artifacts, baskets, and so forth. But then there are these human remains that are still in place. Can you put a little context around that? Because it seems like there was a lot of disrespect for these remains taking place at the time. You talk about the exhumation of these remains, inadvertent exhumation through the destruction of the shell mounds, for instance, right? So when you mention some of these sites in Berkeley, the Emeryville shell mound, and then there was a shell mound apparently where the Berkeley Faculty Club is even, or whatever they found remains. It seems like the norm at the time was to just steamroll these remains, disperse them, use them as gravel, right, and be completely disrespectful. And there wasn't really a respectful way to dispose of these, perhaps other than to bring them into these museums, at least at some point. I mean, what's the context there? What was the alternative?
Well, in the late 19th century and then in the early 20th century, the Bay Area was being rapidly developed. And so kind of land that was at the time unoccupied was being turned into streets and, neighborhoods and whatnot. So for that led, for instance, you mentioned the shell mounds, and there are many, many shell mounds all around the Bay Area that led to the leveling of shell mounds. And the material in the shell mounds would often be taken away and used as paving material or landfill or whatever. The shell mounds were filled with shells and kind of habitation remains, and also lots and lots of human skeletons. So occasionally, the public workers and others who encountered that material would rebury it, but I think typically they wouldn't. Typically, they would just throw it aside or use it for, you know, pavement or whatever. But as you say, very disrespectfully. Sometimes when people making roads or digging, for trains or whatever, making buildings, whatever, sometimes when they found remains, they would ship them to the University of California because it was known that they would take them. Um, in the case of the Bay Area shell mounds, the university sponsored excavations that were done in tandem with the removal of the shell mounds. So as the Berkeley shell mound was being torn down, people from the university would come and excavate and then take lots of material, dirt, archaeological objects, human remains, take them back to the museum. So a very large quantity um, of Berkeley's ancestral remains came from that kind of source, the sort of destructive removal of the Bay Area shell mounds and other sites in the area. But um, there were also excavation archaeological projects that went out with the goal of excavating at a cemetery. So like not something that was otherwise going to be destroyed, but somebody would go and dig up the cemetery to find out what was in there. Um, Maybe that's a minority of what's in the collection, but it's a large minority.
Yeah.
Um,
And so what's the main difference? Because obviously archaeologists have, I mean, we've got Egyptian mummies, we've got human artifacts from all over the world. What's different about the Native American artifacts, both in law and in kind of contemporary sentiment?
Um, I was interested in the book in um, trying to understand why Kroeber, for example, and other people kind of that period, why they thought it was appropriate to do that work.
Mhm.
Kroeber himself wasn't really an excavator; he wasn't really an archaeologist, so he himself didn't do much of that work in California, but he was not opposed to it. He obviously thought it was appropriate to do, and so I think it has to do very much with the sense that people have at any given place and time of who's who owns cultural heritage, who owns this kind of cultural heritage that's in the ground. Um, and I think what I came away thinking is that it goes together with the vanishment assumption. So if you believe that indigenous cultures are gone or going away, then it, I guess, follows from that in some way that ownership over that heritage reverts to the government that has authority over that territory, which is then the California or US governments. But those senses of vanishment and authority and heritage ownership, those are malleable. And I think one thing that has changed in the US between 1900 and now is this, like, now it's very widely accepted that Indigenous people have heritage ownership over their Indigenous territory. Um, and and in the present view, always have had that, and therefore that they should be in charge of what happens to material that was dug up. Probably it shouldn't have been dug up in the first place, and now they should be in charge of what's done with it. That's law at this point. There's
Yeah.
a federal and California NAGPRA law which requires universities to repatriate material to the communities of origin.
But it seems like the view has evolved, right? So there, at one point there was this group identity view, which was that the the people who are alive today feel a cultural identity to the folks who are, um, the remains of these folks who are their ancestors, and there needs to be some kind of cultural connection, and that's why it would be more disrespectful in the Native American sense than it would be, say, with the Egyptian mummies or the say the Trojans or the Etruscans, because people today don't feel that kind of affinity to their ancestors. I mean, is that but then that seems to be sort of a rebirth of this essentialist view, right? That somehow that Native Americans haven't evolved in the way that people in other cultures have evolved.
I think the original NAGPRA law, which I think was from 1990, was very much an essentialist formulation of identity. So, if you were an uh, Native American tribe under NAGPRA, the way that you establish authority to say what, in relation to some archaeological remains, ancestral remains, or objects, the way that you establish authority is precisely by showing some essential cultural connection. Um,
Right.
and that really is a 19th century view of culture, I think, and relationships. Unlike, as you say, what happens in Italy or in Egypt. In Italy, the government of Italy has a sense that Etruscan culture is part of Italian heritage,
Yeah.
whether or not you personally feel a connection to Etruscan people, and the same is true in Egypt. So I think the law has evolved in California, and at this point, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of the way the law has evolved is geographical, national ownership is sufficient. So you no longer have to show that certain ancestral remains are somehow intangibly associated with you culturally, simply that they are found in the area that is your tribal area. And so that makes it more analogous to the Etruscan situation.
Right. So in that sense, then the holding on to the remains is not racist or disrespectful. It's just theft, right? It's like, the Elgin marbles, like in the London Museum, you have the Elgin marbles, and I don't think that that's any evidence of anti-Greek sentiment or belief that the British are a superior race to the Greeks. It's just an act of wanton theft.
I,
I mean, it's a very, very different view of it.
yeah, probably a lot of Greek people would disagree with you.
Yeah, maybe. But look, let's fast forward to the actual unnaming. You said that the findings of the committee were more sort of balanced and subtle than what ultimately the the chancellor wound up saying and what ultimately made it into the public press. How did that happen? I mean, was it just that, okay, if we're going to make this decision, then we have to kind of line up some really strong arguments, and we don't want to do it based on a subtle distinction or a subtle argument. We want to make sure that it's there's no debate here. I mean, how did the findings of the committee ultimately turn into something that was much more dogmatic?
I don't really know what was going on in California Hall, um, which is where the chancellor works, and where the committee probably met. So I'm not quite sure to what extent what happened was error and to what extent it was deliberate. But they were in some way boxed in, I feel, the administration, because it was a good idea to change the name. Like it served no purpose really now. Many people felt injury because of this name. Kroeber had come to be a symbol, as I said, of a toxic relationship and a poisoned history. So, like, there were many excellent reasons to just not have that name on that building. Why would you know, if you want an inclusive campus, you want people to feel at home, you want people to feel welcome going into a building, why would you have a word on the building that makes them feel unwelcome? So I think from that point of view, it seems very natural to make the change. The problem is that the rules that had been set up for unnaming buildings were somewhat strict, and um, they required that you have to say certain things about the person in order to unname a building. The committee in charge of evaluating things, it was a bit, its report was a bit waffly. So it sort of said, here are these accusations. We'll summarize the accusations. Here are some things that people have said. We're not expressing an opinion about the accusations or the things that people have said, but we think it would be good to unname the building. And the chancellor may have felt that that was not sufficient given the rules that had been set up. I'm not really sure what happened, but the chancellor wound up adding things in her statement about it that were not actually in the recommendation of the committee. And what she added then justified, from the point of view of the rules, justified the unnaming, but did go beyond what the committee had actually said.
But it seems like the controversy also offered an opportunity to have a broader conversation that didn't happen because of this quick fix,
Yeah,
right?
it never
So
happens. People
so the
always
people,
say, we don't want to erase history. We'll, we'll take down this name and we'll then have an educational moment,
right?
or something, and those things don't happen.
Because I mean, it seems like if people are experiencing discomfort because of, say, the presence of remains, it seems like it would be a better solution to get rid of the remains rather than get rid of the name of Kroeber. I mean, couldn't it have been an opportunity to say, hey, your discomfort might be based on a lack of in-depth understanding of the history. Maybe we can explore the history together. Maybe if we're going to get rid of a name, we should get rid of Phoebe Hearst's name, right? And discuss the implications of her actions. Because it does seem like there are people who had serious harmful effects on the native population, and their names are still there. And if anybody had a positive impact on the native population, it's probably Kroeber. So maybe, direct the the discomfort in a different direction. Do you feel like we missed an opportunity to have a broader conversation about the impact that the university has had and the players, the contributors, the donors of the university
Sure,
have had?
sure.
Native.
Kroeber and Hearst are obviously different in that Kroeber didn't give any money to the university, and Hearst gave a lot of money. I mean, very few people have been more destructive in California than George Hearst, who has a building, the mining building named after him. And it has been interesting that I have not seen any suggestion that the Hearst name should be removed from campus, which would be quite a project.
Yeah. So, I mean, that means that we never are going to have this conversation, or I mean, are people more interested in feel good measures than in a exploration, which could be not only uncomfortable but difficult?
I don't know. I mean, COVID was going on, so like there were a lot of distractions. I mean, I have hope that eventually these will be conversations that people are interested in having. I mean, I wrote the book in order to initiate that conversation, I guess.
Mhm.
We'll see.
Well, I guess
I don't
last.
think that the advocates of unnaming would think of it as like precisely as a feel good measure. It's more like there's an insult on the wall, or something that I think landed as a slur. Um, why should why should they have to go into a building that has an insult on the wall?
So it seems like when we look at anthropology in today's world, I mean, it's a very political field. It's very contentious. There's a lot of controversy, and that's because they are studying populations which are often in danger. Um, is there something about the legacy of Alfred Kroeber that can be salvaged in the world of anthropology and linguistics that we should honor and respect?
One of the things that was interesting to me about this project was how it caused me to see that 100 years ago or 125 years ago, um, the world of anthropology and the world of linguistics were very closely intertwined, and
Mm,
you could do both of those things.
mm,
And in the middle part of the 20th century, those areas separated, so that there is some overlap. There is something called anthropological linguistics, and there's something called linguistic anthropology. But most anthropologists aren't really involved with language, and most linguists aren't really involved with culture. And that I think has been one of the reasons why what I think is Kroeber's real legacy have not been seen so clearly in
mm,
anthropology, because I think his most important legacy going forward is about language and about storytelling and narrative and oral history. Um, and those are things that are less part of the anthropology world today and more part of the
mm.
linguistics world. But he's usually identified as an anthropologist. So linguists tend to be a bit unaware of what he did, and anthropologists look only at the culture side of what he did and find it less interesting. Um, yeah, this kind of separation has, I think, been part of the difficulty.
Mm. Well, Andrew, thanks so much. The book is called The Unnaming of Kroeber Hall. It's a fantastic history of linguistics and anthropology all the way up to the present. Thanks so much.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.